Welcome to Sinister Stories, where the shadows hold more than just secrets. If you're a fan of the dark and the twisted, you're in the right place. Tonight, we dive into a tale that will send chills down your spine. Before we begin, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss a single spine-tingling story. Mike adjusted his glasses and glanced at the battered dashboard of his Honda. The flickering check engine light mocked him as he pulled into the parking lot of Spirit AeroSystems. Rows of massive industrial buildings loomed ahead, their silhouettes etched against the dark Kansas sky. Tonight marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life. $32 an hour was nothing to scoff at, and he was determined to stick with this job long enough to afford the Dodge Ram he'd been eyeing for months. The HR representative's warnings rang in his ears as he stepped inside the main building. "It's a night shift," she had said, her tone curiously flat. "We take safety and protocol very seriously here. You'll find a list of rules in your locker. Follow them to the letter and you'll be fine." Mike found his locker without issue and pulled open the metal door. Sure enough, there was a sheet of paper pinned to the inside. The list of rules was typed in bold, blocky letters. Always clock in before 10:05 p.m. The system locks you out at 10:06. Do not enter Building 3 unless absolutely necessary. If you hear music coming from inside, walk away immediately. If you see a plane engine start up, stay at least 30 feet away. Avoid looking directly at it. The tunnels beneath the buildings are off limits. If you hear footsteps below, report to the break room immediately. If you hear someone call your name and you're alone, do not respond. At exactly 3:33 a.m., return to your station and remain still for 60 seconds, no matter what happens. Mike chuckled nervously, wondering if this was some sort of elaborate hazing ritual for new hires. But as he stuffed the paper into his pocket, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. The shift started smoothly enough. Mike spent the first hour patrolling the expansive floor of Building 1, marveling at the precision of the robotic arms assembling sections of airplane fuselages. The quiet hum of machinery filled the air, a far cry from the chaos of his last job at a fast food joint. Around midnight, he ventured toward Building 2. The lights flickered as he walked through the corridor connecting the two buildings, but he brushed it off as old wiring. As he entered the cavernous space, a strange sensation washed over him, a subtle but undeniable pressure, like being underwater. A loud clank broke the silence. Mike froze, his flashlight beam sweeping the room. One of the robotic arms, idle just moments before, was now extended, its metallic fingers clutching an invisible object. His heart raced as the arm pivoted slowly toward him, then stopped. "Just a malfunction," he muttered, backing away. But the words felt hollow. By 2 a.m., Mike had settled into a rhythm. He followed the patrol routes laid out in his orientation materials, careful not to deviate. The rules from his locker echoed in his mind, and while he wasn't sure he believed in ghosts or curses, he figured it wouldn't hurt to play along. Then he heard it, a faint, muffled voice. "Mike!" He stopped in his tracks. The voice was unmistakable, but the hallway was empty. Cold sweat trickled down his neck as he remembered Rule 5. If you hear someone call your name and you're alone, do not respond. His pulse quickened. The voice called again, closer this time. "Mike, help me." It was almost pleading. He turned on his heel and sprinted toward the break room. The walls seemed to close in around him as the voice continued to echo, growing fainter with each step. When he finally burst into the break room, the sound stopped abruptly. Breathing heavily, he leaned against the table and checked his watch. 2:27 a.m., an hour and 6 minutes until he needed to follow Rule 6. As the clock inched toward 3:33 a.m., Mike stationed himself in Building 4, where a row of airplane engines sat in eerie silence. He kept his distance, recalling Rule 3. His eyes darted to the shadows, every creak and groan of the building amplifying his paranoia. When the digital clock on the wall struck 3:33, he stopped moving entirely. The seconds dragged on, each tick of his watch a thunderous drumbeat in his ears. Suddenly, the overhead lights dimmed, and the entire building seemed to exhale. A low rumble reverberated through the floor. The nearest plane engine roared to life, its blades spinning with impossible speed. Tools and debris lifted into the air, swirling in a chaotic vortex. Mike's instincts screamed at him to run, but he gritted his teeth and stayed rooted, counting the seconds. When his watch hit 3:34, the chaos stopped. The engine powered down, the lights returned to normal, and the floating objects clattered to the floor. Mike stumbled backward, his legs trembling. The rest of the shift passed without incident, but as Mike clocked out, he couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching him. By the second night, Mike's nerves were raw. The unsettling events from the first shift lingered in his mind, and he found himself obsessively reading over the list of rules. Every word now seemed less like a joke and more like a lifeline. He clocked in at 10:03 p.m., the glowing numbers on the machine feeling ominously final. Tonight, the supervisor, a wiry man named Gus, handed him a more detailed patrol map. "Building 3?" Mike asked, raising an eyebrow. He remembered Rule 2. Gus shrugged. "You shouldn't need to go in there. Just keep an ear out for anything weird." That wasn't reassuring. Mike's shift began uneventfully, walking his assigned path through the labyrinthine plant. The rhythmic whir of machinery offered a strange comfort as he moved between buildings. By midnight, he had reached the southern edge of the property, where the tunnels were located. The tunnels had been briefly mentioned in his orientation, a network of underground passages used to move supplies and equipment in bad weather. But standing at the entrance now, Mike couldn't help but feel like they had been abandoned for a reason. The steel hatch leading down was cracked open. A faint draft carried a sour, metallic scent to his nose. He shivered and was about to step back when he heard it again. Footsteps. They echoed faintly, coming from the darkened depths below. His flashlight wavered as he pointed it into the opening. The steps were deliberate and slow, like someone or something was taking its time. Mike's stomach churned as he remembered Rule 4. The tunnels beneath the buildings are off limits. If you hear footsteps below, report to the break room immediately. He turned and made a beeline for safety, but the sound of footsteps quickened. His breath came in short gasps as he bolted through the empty halls, the echoing steps chasing him with inhuman speed. When he reached the break room, the noise stopped. Silence pressed down on him like a weight. His hands trembled as he fumbled for his radio and called Gus. "Someone's in the tunnels," he whispered. "Stay put," Gus replied. "I'll check it out." Gus never returned. By 2 a.m., Mike decided to continue his patrol alone. He was halfway through Building 5 when a strange noise stopped him in his tracks, a soft humming. It took him a moment to realize it wasn't coming from a machine but from a person. The sound led him to a darkened corner where a shadowy figure stood hunched over a workbench. Mike's flashlight flickered as he aimed it toward the figure. "Gus!" he called, though he already knew it wasn't his supervisor. The figure straightened and turned, revealing a face that wasn't a face at all. Its features were blurred like a photograph smudged with water. Its mouth opened, emitting a guttural static-like sound that made Mike's teeth ache. Before he could react, the figure dissolved into a swirling mist and vanished. At 3 a.m., Mike found himself in Building 3, despite every fiber of his being telling him to stay away. The door creaked ominously as he pushed it open. The space inside was unnervingly still. Rows of half-assembled fuselages stretched into the shadows, their skeletal forms resembling massive, slumbering beasts. Mike's flashlight beam caught something strange, a pool of light spilling from an open hatch in the floor. Against his better judgment, he approached the hatch. A ladder descended into the tunnels, and from below, faint music wafted upward, soft, melodic, and wrong. He took a step back, his heart hammering as Rule 2 flashed in his mind. If you hear music coming from inside, walk away immediately. The melody grew louder, more insistent. For a moment, Mike thought he saw something moving in the shadows below, a writhing mass of indistinct forms. He bolted, slamming the door shut behind him. At 3:33 a.m., Mike returned to his station and froze, as instructed. He clutched the list of rules like a talisman, counting the seconds in his head. For 60 seconds, the world around him warped. Shadows twisted unnaturally, stretching across walls and ceilings. Disembodied whispers hissed in his ears, speaking in a language he couldn't understand. When the minute passed, everything returned to normal. Mike leaned against the wall, exhausted and terrified. He realized then that quitting wasn't an option, not yet. Something about this place wanted him here, and he needed to understand why. Mike arrived for his third shift already dreading what lay ahead. The events of the previous nights played on a loop in his mind. The footsteps in the tunnels, the faceless figure, the oppressive rules that seemed to be his only lifeline. His trusty list had become worn and creased, as if his life depended on its clarity. He clocked in with a minute to spare, and immediately noticed something was off. The usual hum of the factory was subdued, almost muted, like the machines themselves were holding their breath. Gus was still missing, and the absence of a supervisor left the air thick with unease. Mike tried to shake it off, convincing himself he could survive just a few more nights. Tonight, his patrol route took him past the central assembly floor in Building 1. The massive robotic arms moved with precision during the day, assembling airplane components. But now, in the dead of night, they seemed to have a mind of their own. Mike was midway through the floor when he heard a sharp clank. One of the arms had sprung to life, its mechanical joints creaking as it reached toward the ceiling. At first, it seemed random, but then it swiveled, pointing directly at him. His flashlight flickered as he stood frozen in place. The robotic arm twitched, lowering slightly as if it was studying him. Suddenly, it slammed down, striking the ground just feet away. Sparks flew, and Mike scrambled backward, barely dodging its erratic movements. He sprinted toward the exit, the sound of screeching metal echoing behind him. Just before he reached the door, the arm stopped moving, falling limp as though nothing had happened. Mike's breathing was still ragged as he entered the maintenance hallway connecting Building 2 and Building 3. His flashlight illuminated rows of old, rusted lockers and forgotten tools. The air felt heavier here, and the faint scent of oil mixed with something rancid. Halfway down the hall, he heard it again. The humming. It was the same melodic tune he had heard near the tunnels the previous night. But this time, it wasn't faint. It was close. Too close. He spun around, but the hallway was empty. "Stop it," he muttered, gripping his flashlight tighter. The humming grew louder, reverberating through the hall. Mike's ears began to ring as a shadow appeared at the end of the corridor. It was tall and spindly, its form unnatural and shifting, like smoke trapped in a glass jar. The figure moved toward him, its steps soundless. Mike backed away, his heart pounding. The humming turned into words, a disjointed, distorted voice that whispered, "Why are you here?" He didn't wait to answer. Turning on his heel, he bolted into Building 3. Building 3 was worse than he remembered. The dim overhead lights cast long, flickering shadows, and the skeletons of airplane fuselages loomed like grotesque statues. He kept his distance from the hatch leading to the tunnels, but his curiosity was growing harder to suppress. As he moved through the building, he noticed something strange. On one of the fuselages there were scratches, not random marks, but deliberate carvings. He stepped closer, shining his flashlight over the jagged letters, Leave. A chill ran down his spine. The scratches looked fresh, as though made moments before his arrival. His radio crackled to life, startling him. "Mike! Mike, come in!" a voice rasped. It sounded like Gus, but there was something off. His tone was strained, almost mechanical. Mike hesitated. The rules flashed in his mind. If you hear someone call your name and you're alone, do not respond. The radio buzzed again and the voice grew more insistent. "Mike, I need you in Building 4. It's urgent." He clenched his fists and stayed silent. The buzzing stopped abruptly, leaving the air eerily quiet. By 3 a.m., Mike found himself near the break room trying to gather his thoughts. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being herded, guided towards something, or away from something. The list of rules sat heavy in his pocket. He unfolded it, scanning the instructions for any clue he might have missed. One rule caught his attention again. If you hear footsteps below, report to the break room immediately. Why were the tunnels forbidden? What was down there? The thought gnawed at him, and despite his fear, he felt an overwhelming urge to know the truth. At 3:33 a.m., Mike followed Rule 6 as he had before. Standing motionless in the break room, he counted each second in his head. This time, the building didn't simply warp, it seemed to dissolve. For a fleeting moment, he saw through the walls and floors, glimpsing the tunnels below. Dark shapes moved within them, twisting and writhing like serpents in the depths. He blinked, and the vision was gone. When the shift ended, Mike barely made it to his car. The Honda sputtered to life as he collapsed into the driver's seat, shaking. He knew now that this job wasn't just dangerous, it was a trap, but he wasn't ready to quit. Not yet. He needed answers. The sun was just starting to cast its first gray light over the city as Mike left the plant. His hands trembled on the steering wheel, and every muscle in his body ached from the tension of the night. The Honda wheezed and chugged as if it too were desperate for rest. Mike's eyes drifted toward the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something move behind him. But there was nothing, only the quiet streets of Wichita beginning to wake up. He barely slept before returning to the factory that evening, but he came armed with new determination. He had to find out what was hidden beneath Spirit AeroSystems and why the rules were so specific. Why was Gus missing? Why did the machines move on their own? And what was that shadowy figure with its faceless form and dissonant voice? Mike clocked in with a mix of dread and resolve. It was 10 p.m., and the air inside the building felt colder than usual, even for a factory. A low hum vibrated through the floor, like the growl of a beast lying just beneath the surface. He was startled by a sudden static crackle from his radio. "Mike, come in," a distorted voice said. "Gus?" Mike answered, trying to keep the quaver out of his voice. There was a pause, then a sharp laugh so harsh and metallic it made Mike flinch. Not Gus, but close enough. Before he could respond, the voice cut out, replaced by a long, guttural sigh that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. By midnight, Mike's shift had taken a turn for the worse. As he made his way through the vast assembly line in Building 1, he heard it again. The humming. It was louder now, resonating as though it were coming from inside his own head. He slowed his pace, scanning the shadows. That's when he noticed the robotic arms, once dormant, were now shifting as if alive. One of them reached out, its metal claw inching toward a half-finished fuselage. The fingers curled as if beckoning him forward. He stumbled backward, recalling Rule 3. Do not approach the mechanical arms unless instructed. The flashlight wavered in his hand as he felt a wave of dizziness wash over him. The humming grew louder, no longer just a tune but a chant, rising and falling with each passing second. He spun around and ran down the hallway into Building 2, heart pounding, footsteps echoing behind him. But it wasn't just his own. Heavy, dragging footsteps followed, each one closer than the last. A sudden cold burst of air hit him as he skidded to a stop. The lights flickered, and for a moment everything went dark. When they came back on, Mike found himself face to face with an apparition, a figure cloaked in shadows with eyes that were hollowed-out pits. "Why do you stay?" the figure whispered, its voice like the rustle of leaves caught in a storm. Mike couldn't move. His chest tightened as though invisible hands were squeezing him. He remembered Rule 5. If you see the shadow in the corner, leave the building. But he couldn't leave. Not this time. He had to know what was happening, who, or what, was trying to keep him from leaving. Mike snapped out of his paralysis and sprinted to the break room. The hum still resonated in the distance, but now it sounded distorted, tangled in a chorus of voices. He threw open the break room door and slammed it shut, leaning against it to catch his breath. "Mike!" A voice called from the darkness, soft and broken. He spun around, seeing nothing but the faint light filtering through the cracked blinds. But the voice continued. It was Gus, or at least a version of him. His face was ashen, eyes wide with terror. "They're waiting for you," Gus whispered. "Down there. Don't go." "But I have to. I need to understand," Mike said, his voice breaking. Gus shook his head, but his image flickered, distorting as if made of smoke. "There's no understanding, only survival." The radio crackled again, a chillingly familiar static followed by a command. "Mike, come back to Building 3. It's time." The sound sent a shiver down his spine. Rule 6 came to mind. If they call you back to Building 3, do not go alone. He glanced at the dim hallway, the exit to the building just a few paces away. But he knew he had no choice. With his flashlight clutched in one hand and the other clutching the list of rules, Mike stepped into Building 3. The building was eerily silent, the machinery dead, but an invisible presence pressed on him, heavy and suffocating. The hum still reverberated through the walls, now mingled with a low growl, like a predator waiting for its prey. He hesitated by the open hatch to the tunnels, the faint light from the shaft casting long, shifting shadows across the floor. The urge to step down and face whatever lay below was almost irresistible. The last rule came to him. If you hear the voice in the tunnel, do not answer. Mike took a deep breath and stepped forward. The floor groaned under his weight, and the shadows shifted in a way that seemed almost sentient. He peered into the darkness, feeling the air grow colder. "Why did you come?" a voice whispered from the depths. Mike's heart leaped into his throat. This was it. He had crossed the threshold and there was no turning back. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the uneven sound of Mike's breathing and the distant rhythmic hum. He glanced back, half expecting to see Gus's shadow or a faceless figure waiting for him to turn around. But there was only the dark, yawning tunnel. A shiver rippled down his spine as he felt the ground shift slightly beneath his feet. He swallowed hard, gripping the flashlight like a weapon as he stepped down into the tunnel. It smelled of oil and metal, the air damp and thick with something metallic and unnatural. The walls, once solid and industrial, seemed to dissolve into an organic, pulsating surface, as if the building had grown a heartbeat of its own. The voice whispered again, more insistent this time. "You shouldn't have come." Mike's pulse quickened. He forced himself to keep moving, each step feeling like it might be his last. He knew the rules. Never venture into the tunnels alone. Never respond to the voice in the dark. But the urge to know what was beneath the factory, to understand what Gus had tried to warn him about, was stronger than his fear. As he moved deeper, the light from his flashlight flickered. Shadows pooled in the corners, weaving together to form shapes that resembled human figures with hollow eyes and contorted smiles. He looked away, his heart hammering in his chest. A low mechanical groan rose up from the darkness, vibrating through the concrete floor. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as a series of clicks followed. It was coming closer. Mike didn't dare turn around. He knew that whatever was following him was not something he wanted to see. Suddenly, the tunnel widened into a cavernous room filled with a horrible sight. Dozens of robotic arms, their joints creaking, some bent in unnatural angles, others moving rhythmically as if they were conducting an orchestra of chaos. At the center of the room, a single plane engine roared to life, the sound deafening. No pilot, no crew, just the unrelenting hum of the turbine, flaring and sputtering like a beast in its death throes. He had to get out of there. Mike's feet stumbled back and he turned to run, but he collided with something solid. He fell hard against the floor, pain shooting through his shoulder. Looking up, he found himself face to face with a figure dressed in ragged work clothes, its face obscured by shadows. It reached out, and for a moment Mike could see its eyes, dark and hollow, like two black holes in a lifeless face. "You should never have come," the figure whispered again. It grabbed his arm, nails digging into his skin like claws. Mike screamed, yanking himself free. He scrambled to his feet and ran back toward the entrance of the tunnel, the sound of his heart pounding in his ears, mingling with the mechanical noise behind him. The whisper grew louder, almost deafening, as if the entire factory were speaking in one voice. "Leave!" it screamed. "You're not meant to be here!" He didn't stop running until he was back in the break room, gasping for air. The lights flickered and the walls seemed to shift, closing in around him. He glanced at the list of rules, now damp from his sweat, and realized he had broken every single one. The voice, the shadow, the tunnels, all of it was part of the dark, unending nightmare that had become his life. As the first rays of dawn began to seep through the blinds, Mike felt the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He knew he couldn't come back. Whatever haunted Spirit AeroSystems had shown him what it wanted: fear, confusion, and the understanding that he was just another pawn in its game. He looked at the list one last time before tearing it to shreds and letting the pieces fall to the floor. "Survive," he whispered, before fleeing into the morning light. The next day, as he packed up his belongings from the car and prepared to head out, the factory loomed behind him, dark and silent. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see that faceless figure standing in the doorway, but there was nothing. Just a stillness that seemed to mock him. Mike knew he was never coming back, and as he drove away, his heart pounded, not just from fear but from relief. He had survived, but he wasn't sure how much of himself he'd left behind in those tunnels. Spirit AeroSystems was not just a factory. It was a place where reality fractured, where machines had souls and shadows whispered secrets. And Mike, who had learned the hard way that some mysteries were never meant to be solved, knew he would never forget what he had seen. Mike tried to put the factory behind him, to convince himself it was nothing more than a fever dream born from the exhaustion and terror of that night. The next few weeks were a blur of restless sleep and anxious glances over his shoulder. He picked up odd jobs where he could, staying as far from the factory as possible. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him, an invisible stain clinging to his mind. Every time he passed Spirit AeroSystems, he couldn't help but look over. The building loomed like a grave, its steel walls glistening in the sunlight, deceptive in their calm. The sounds that haunted him, whispers, mechanical growls, the metallic hum, still echoed in his head, a chorus of dread that refused to fade. One night, after a particularly long shift at a convenience store, Mike woke up to a sound that made his blood run cold, the mechanical whir of gears turning, distant but unmistakable. It was the same sound he'd heard in the tunnels. He sat up, eyes darting around the dark room of his apartment. "Just the wind," he whispered to himself, though he knew it wasn't true. The noise came again, louder this time, as if something unseen was moving through the air, circling him. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone, half hoping, half fearing that it might be a message from Gus, but there was nothing. He stepped into the hallway, the building quiet as a tomb. He made his way to the front door, but the sound followed him, faint at first, then more definite. It was like a mechanical heartbeat, pulsing with intent. He glanced down at the cracked tiles beneath his feet and noticed something he hadn't before: a dark, wet mark that led out from under his front door and down the hallway. The mark resembled oil, but there was something more to it. Something that shimmered, almost alive. Mike stood frozen, staring at the trail as it twisted through the hallway and ended at the stairwell. He swallowed hard, dread pooling in his gut. The stairwell door creaked open, and there, framed in the doorway, was a figure he'd seen only in his worst nightmares. The same shadowy form from the factory, with those deep, hollow eyes, now standing inches away from him. "Why did you come?" it whispered again, its voice sharp and bone-chilling. He took a step back, nearly tripping over his own feet. I didn't mean to," he stammered, trying to find his voice. The figure tilted its head, its smile widening like a rift. "It's too late. You're part of it now." Suddenly, the air grew cold and the lights flickered, casting thin, twitching shadows across the room. Mike realized with a sickening certainty that the voice wasn't just echoing in his ears. It was in his mind, a thread of consciousness tied to the factory itself. He could almost feel the hum, the pulse of that place, in his bones. The memory of the rules crashed over him. He had ignored them, broken them, and now he was paying the price. The shadow reached out, long fingers brushing his arm, icy and unnatural. "Leave," it said, its voice turning soft and pleading. Mike didn't need to be told twice. He bolted out of the building, gasping for air as he sprinted into the night. Behind him, the sound of gears grinding and engines roaring echoed down the hallway, mingled with a low, haunted laugh. He found himself at the edge of the city, the lights of Spirit AeroSystems just visible on the horizon. He stopped to catch his breath, looking back over his shoulder. The night air was thick, vibrating with a sound he couldn't place. like a distant heartbeat, the deep thrum of an ancient machine. His mind raced, haunted by the whispers and metallic moans that only he seemed to hear. It was then that he saw it, a figure standing by the entrance, shadowed and still. It lifted an arm and pointed, not at him but at the factory itself. Mike couldn't tell if it was Gus or another lost soul who had dared to cross the line. But the message was clear. No one left Spirit AeroSystems unchanged. The rules, the voices, the darkness, they were more than warnings. They were the plant's way of claiming its victims, drawing them into its impossible labyrinth. And now, with that figure in the doorway, Mike knew the factory had claimed him as well. Mike left that city for good the next day, his old Honda now abandoned, the road ahead filled with nothing but the uncertain glow of a new dawn. But the factory and the echoes of its haunting stayed with him, seared into his mind. They whispered to him in the dark, every night, reminding him that he was never truly free. Spirit AeroSystems was still out there, waiting, always waiting. And Mike knew that even if he were to leave this life behind, the shadows would follow, lingering in the silence, forever calling his name. This was Mike's final lesson. Some places, some memories, are built not just of steel and mortar, but of something much darker. And once they touch you, you never escape.